About it for Ari Berman. How are you, sir?
Hey, Mark. Good to see you. Thank you.
Congratulations on the book.
Thank you.
Yeah. You know, I was just mentioning one of the things we do in this country, Ari, is, by the way, do you say it Ari or you say it Ari?
Ari.
Okay,
Unless
cool.
you were
Thank
my
you.
old Jewish grandpa in Brooklyn,
Okay.
then it was Ari.
Okay. So, Ari, one of the things that we do in this country is we talk about the founding fathers with almost a deification of these guys. And they did do something very difficult. But we even speak of the Constitution in a sort of deified way. And you start with what I think is such an interesting and important fact, which is that the Constitution is almost by definition, because of the way it had to be haggled out, an imperfect document.
That's right, Mark. It's kind of the Hamiltonian version of history. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but these heroic figures in powdered wigs, right? That's how we think of the founding fathers. And as you say, the Constitution was a remarkable document, but it was also a document that in many ways constricted rather than expanded democracy. Because you think about the structures that were in place. The people were excluded from being able to elect most of the government. So the House of Representatives was the only popularly elected branch of the government at the time of the Constitution. And then all of these privileged minorities took more power when it came to who would control these institutions. So the slave states won more power in the House because of the 3/5 clause. The small states won more power in the Senate because each state, regardless of population, would get 2 senators. These were called compromises, but were much more like concessions. The president was not directly elected by the people because the founders didn't trust the people to elect the president. So they created this complicated electoral college scheme that was based in part on representation in the House and the Senate. So then the slave states and the small states had more power to elect the president. Then, of course, unelected senators and unelected presidents, at least in terms of the people, would then choose the Supreme Court. So in many ways, we are still living with this architecture of minority rule today.
And what I'm hearing is that because of that, we end up with, as this culture politically has evolved, with this minority, as your book title states, really making decisions for a lot of people who don't support the policies of that minority.
That's right. What we have right now is an elite conservative white minority that is holding a majority of power despite not having majority support. And the founding fathers were concerned primarily with protecting their own interests, protecting the interests of white male property owners, many of whom owned large amounts of land, many of whom also owned slaves. And even as our institutions have democratized so that presidents are elected mostly by the people, although we can debate that, or senators are elected by the people, we still have these institutions that have not been reformed. We still have a situation in which the people do not directly elect the president, and the president is not chosen by a majority vote. We still have a situation in which the U.S. Senate, California has 68 times the representation, the population of Wyoming, but the same level of representation in the Senate. That skews how we elect presidents. That skews how we choose senators. That skews the justices that are on the Supreme Court. And then politics can also be manipulated at the state level through things like gerrymandering and voter suppression. So we have this ideal of one person, one vote that we talk about in terms of democracy, but many of our institutions don't actually live up to that ideal of one person, one vote.
So as I'm listening to you and reading what you have chronicled, it sounds like we still have exactly what they had with that original document. You have wealthy, white, I guess it was landowners then. I don't know. You can fill it. Let's just go wealthy, white owners of something. It can be a participants in business and corporate structure, really running the show over those that have the illusion of a vote that matters. While it does matter in some ways, you're saying much of the system leaves that vote sort of irrelevant through gerrymandering and voter suppression and that kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think the system's obviously been democratized in a way that it wasn't back then. So I don't think anyone would argue the system is exactly the same, right? I mean, many people could not vote back then who can vote now. We have things like the Voting Rights Act that did not exist now. So we have, at least in theory, the promise of multiracial democracy now that did not exist back then, when voting was restricted only to white men, and in many cases only white men with property. So in that case, we've made a lot of advances. But as I said, we still have a situation in which how we elect presidents violates one person, one vote. How we elect senators violates one person, one vote. The composition of the Supreme Court, by virtue of this, violates one person, one vote. And I think that in many people, I think, believe that we've democratized more than we actually have. And if you look at someone's vote in the Senate, smaller, rural, more conservative states have far more power in the Senate than more diverse, more urban states. When it comes to the presidential election, the fact is, for 80% of the country, their vote doesn't matter when it comes to presidential elections because the outcomes are predetermined. And the fact is, that's bad for people in both parties. That's the argument I'm always making. If you're a Republican in California, and as you know, Mark, there's a lot of them, their votes don't matter in presidential elections. And if you're a Democrat in a red state, and there's a lot of those too, your vote doesn't really matter. So the only people that are really benefiting are the small number of people in swing states. And even they don't like it because they're then bombarded by TV ads and candidates, and they can't even watch Monday Night Football without seeing 4 political ads every commercial break. And so I think the system right now doesn't serve the majority, but I also just think it doesn't serve most people regardless of their ideology. And I think that's why, if you look at polling, 80% of the public wants to get rid of the Electoral College and things of that nature. Large majorities disagree, for example, on the direction of the Supreme Court. To me, the problem is not that we don't have a pro-democracy majority in this country. I think we do have a pro-democracy majority. I think it's too often that the pro-democracy majority doesn't actually allow their voices to be put into law and policy.
We're talking to Ari Berman. His new book is Minority Rule, and I want to ask you about a specific thing in a moment, but I kind of want to follow, and the specific thing relates to Wisconsin. I love the back and forth that happened in Wisconsin, but I wonder if I can just follow up with what you've just said. It sounds as though the political center of gravity, sort of when they were beginning this whole process, the forging of the Constitution and the new nation, it was cheated toward those southern states. That were concessions made, to use your word. And that ripple effect of those concessions is something that we're still living with in the ways that you've just detailed.
That's right. So there were a lot of really interesting debates at the time when the Constitution was drafted. And the question was, how would these institutions be formed and who would they represent? And what happened was that these privileged minority factions essentially took the rest of the Constitution hostage when it came to the House, the Senate, other things. The slave states said, we want more power in the House because our slaves are disenfranchised, therefore they won't count for purposes of representation. And that's how we got the 3/5 clause, saying that enslaved people would be counted as 3/5 of a person only for purposes of representation. So that meant the slave states got more power in the House. The same thing happened with small states in the Senate. The small states said, if Delaware doesn't get the same representation as Virginia, Delaware is going to leave the Union and join France, which is just about the worst thing you could say in 1787. When it came to electing...
And they were literally talking about that.
They literally said, we're going to leave the Union. We'll find a foreign ally who will give us a better deal. I mean, so Virginia had no choice then but to agree to those terms on the Senate, just like Pennsylvania had no choice but to agree to those terms in the House, because otherwise the Constitution was going to fall apart. And the fascinating thing is, when it came to electing the president, the most important decision of all, James Madison, who was the most influential of the founders from Virginia, actually says, I think there should be a direct election of the president. I think the people should choose the president. The problem is, if that happens, the slave states will be at a disadvantage because our slaves won't be able to vote. So basically, he's admitting that if not for the slave states, we might not actually even have an electoral college in the first place, because the electoral college was only worked out basically because the founding fathers wouldn't agree to a direct election of the president. And one of the reasons they wouldn't agree to a direct election of the president was because it would have hurt the slave state. So I think people don't realize how many of these quote unquote compromises, because we think of compromise as a good thing, right? We're actually just basically concessions that were the product of hostage taking at the time, and how much they shaped our institutions 230 years later, that we still have not substantively gotten rid of the Electoral College. We have not changed how representation works in the Senate. We have not changed how Supreme Court justices are nominated or how they serve. All of these things are basically unchanged with some modifications since 1787.
It strikes me that, first of all, that's fascinating, and it just puts so many specifics in, in a way that make you realize, this nation was forged in a super imperfect way from a kind of heinous history that we've tried to correct, but some things, it would seem to me, haven't been corrected for political reasons, right? Ari Berman, I mean, the reason the Electoral College is still there, just to focus on that, and as I say, we'll get to Wisconsin and representation in the judiciary, et cetera, in a second, but the Electoral College itself is a power grab.
Yeah, I mean, it is a power grab. I mean, it's a power grab. First off, it favors wider, more conservative, more rural areas because the Electoral College is based on not just overall population, but representation of the House and the Senate is overrepresented towards those states. It also is biased towards a small number of swing states, many of which are wider and more Republican than the country as a whole. The fascinating thing is that we almost abolished the Electoral College in the 1960s. And this was one of the things I learned in my research. It was supported, a direct election of the president was supported by Richard Nixon and Lyndon Johnson and the Chamber of Commerce and the AFL-CIO. So there was a pretty broad support for it. It was also supported by about 80% of the public, meaning that when it came to a constitutional amendment to get rid of it, there might have actually been 3/4 of the states that have been willing to do it. The problem is that it needed the support of 2/3 of the Congress. And what happened was it was filibustered in the Senate by Southern segregationists that basically said that if there was a direct election of the president, that would give black voters the same power as white voters in those Southern states. So the Southern senators blocked it. So you see, different undemocratic aspects of the system have preserved other undemocratic aspects of the system. The filibuster, which is another anti-democratic remnant of the 1800s, basically was used then to preserve the Electoral College, which is probably the most fundamentally undemocratic part of the political system today.
Well,
and so even though about 80% of Americans don't like it, it's hard to imagine a constitutional amendment getting rid of it. There is this thing called the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact, where if states equaling 270 electoral votes pledge to appoint their electors to the winner of the popular vote, that could get rid of the Electoral College another way, although obviously there would be a huge fight about it, and I'm sure the Supreme Court would be very willing and eager to step in and decide it at the end of the day.
Well, this is the other thing, and just because you mentioned the court, let me go to Wisconsin, because what happened in Wisconsin was scary. I remember reading about the power grab that was going on in Wisconsin initially, but then something happened in Wisconsin. I wonder if you could just take us through a little bit of the history of the redistricting maps and what happened in Wisconsin with the judiciary there ultimately.
Well, what happened is Wisconsin is one of those states that went red after the 2010 election and really became a laboratory for a lot of the undemocratic stuff that Republicans wanted to do, such as voter suppression, going after labor unions, doing extreme partisan gerrymandering. In Wisconsin, that gerrymandering was extremely effective. Democrats in one election got 54% of the votes statewide, but Republicans got 64% of seats in the state house, which is just astonishing. And the Republicans took control of the courts, which allowed them to uphold these policies. More recently, the Wisconsin Supreme Court has shifted from a conservative majority to a progressive majority, and the Wisconsin Supreme Court struck down those gerrymandered maps for the first time last year. That means there were fair maps put in place. The legislature and the governor actually agreed on new maps. The legislature passed the governor's redistricting maps, which would have been inconceivable a few years ago. And that means that Wisconsin will have competitive elections at the state level for the first time in 2024, which is a really big deal. And I think one of the major themes of my book is this push and pull between anti-democratic and democratic forces throughout American history. And that's playing out right now at the state level in places like Wisconsin, where you have these anti-democratic factions that have exercised a lot of control over the last decade and a half, but you also have pro-democracy forces making real gains and trying to make the political system more fair, because we don't know if Democrats or Republicans are actually going to win a majority under fair maps. But the fact is, there is an equal opportunity for them to win a majority. And that's how the system should ultimately work.
Didn't the Wisconsin redistricting, they did it almost literally under the cloak of darkness. I mean, they did the whole thing in this way that it reminded me of the tax cut that was rushed through when Trump became president. I mean, it was almost like the ink wasn't dry, almost literally, on the documents.
Yeah, what happened in 2011 for the first time in Wisconsin history is they didn't actually draw the redistricting maps at the state legislature. They went across the street to the GOP's law firm. They had what they called a map room. They made every legislator sign a confidentiality agreement, and they wouldn't discuss the maps. Only Republicans saw them, and they were basically passed a week later after they were introduced, with no Democrats seeing them ahead of time. And they radically changed control of that state, because you basically had a 50-50 state at the presidential level, at statewide races, but you had almost 2/3 supermajorities in both houses of the legislature because of gerrymandering. So state politics was basically predetermined there. And that had really, really negative effects. It meant that lots of popular policies, things on gun control, on voting rights, and criminal justice reform, what have you, didn't become law. And it meant that a lot of unpopular things did become law. And it meant that the people's voice was essentially meaningless, at least when it came to the state legislative level. Wisconsin isn't the only state where this has happened, but I think it's an extreme example of what's become an increasingly common problem.
I kind of remember, wasn't it Wisconsin in which the governor's powers, once a Democrat was elected, were undermined by the
Yes.
Yeah.
That's right. When Wisconsin finally elected a Democratic governor in 2018, Tony Evers, who defeated Scott Walker, who was one of the architects of this conservative takeover, the state legislature, which was controlled by Republicans, convened a lame duck session right before Christmas and stripped power from the incoming Democratic governor. And it was referred to as a soft coup. And I interviewed the Democratic governor, Tony Evers, in 2022, and I asked him, did you view this as a warm-up act for the insurrection? And he said, yeah, it was. This was basically the response of the Republican Party. If you don't like the outcome of the election, just try to strip power from those people. And of course, Trump took it one step further and just tried to overturn the election altogether. But my point here is, at the state level, Republicans were radicalizing against democracy before Trump. And in many ways, that opened the door for an authoritarian like Trump to emerge and be popular in Republican circles.
Yeah, it was alarming. I remember just thinking, like, this could be replicated elsewhere, this same kind of coup, as you say. We've got just a couple of questions for you from the audience, and I've got a couple more. And I'm so excited that you're on the show. And people are asking, John Watson says, so what does your guest think we can do about the Electoral College? I feel like you kind of addressed that. But the best chance for Electoral College going away is probably not through Congress, right? It just doesn't serve enough political interest to get rid of it, right?
It's just hard to imagine it getting the support of 2/3 of Congress and 3/4 of the states. I mean, that allows 1/4 of the states basically to block any kind of constitutional amendment. And that's why there hasn't been any major constitutional amendments passed in the last 50 years. And so I think this national interstate popular vote compact, where the states get 270 electoral votes and pledge to get rid of it, I think that would be very controversial, but I think that's a lot more feasible than a constitutional amendment, because those states are at 209 electoral votes now. So they're not that far away. It's not like they're at 50. I mean, you can imagine in the next decade or so getting states with 60 more electoral college votes to sign on. And so I think that's something that we should talk about more. I don't think we should just say that this insane way we elect presidents every 4 years, we might have to deal with it, but I don't think we should treat it like it's normal.
You know, I grew up in Washington, D.C., so I look at Washington, D.C., I look at Puerto Rico, these places that will never really see voting representation under this system because of entrenched political beliefs. I mean, that's a power grab that's playing against them. And it's tough to break those log jams, isn't it, Ari?
It is. I mean, I think that's to me, that's a no-brainer, particularly Washington, D.C. I mean, there's not a single good argument for why Wyoming has 100,000 fewer people than Washington, D.C. But Washington, D.C. has no real representation in the Congress. I mean, when Republicans wanted to create more seats in the Senate, they literally broke up North and South Dakota. That's why we have North and South Dakota. People don't even realize this is true. Like, there's no reason that there should even be a North and South Dakota. Like, it was just done to give 4 Republican seats in the Senate. And so the system has changed at various times. And I think people think that we have to have 50 states. We have to have this. We have to have that. Like, the country's changed many times. There's no reason why Washington, D.C. can't become a state. There's no reason why Puerto Rico can become a state. I mean, there's a number of U.S. territories in which people are U.S. citizens that don't have representation in Congress. So if you can't change the whole structure of the Senate, which is very, very hard, then you could at least admit new states in a way that there would be a lower barrier to entry in terms of making representation fairer.
B.A. Ware asks, Ari, does anything keep a state from passing legislation that takes the vote for president away from the people and give it to the state legislature?
Well, I think rules governing how electors are chosen, for example, like the Electoral Count Act has just been clarified. And that's actually one good thing that has happened more recently. It has been clarified to say that state legislatures have to follow the will of their state's voters. That's in state constitutions, but it's also in federal law as well. So one of the things that the Trump administration tried to do in 2020 was tell states, hey, just disregard the will of your state's voters and appoint your own Trump electors. That kind of scheme is going to be a lot harder to pull off in 2024. Doesn't mean they won't try, but at least one good thing Congress did, they didn't pass major voting rights legislation, which I think they should have, but they did reform this Electoral Count Act that basically was from the 1800s and had a lot of ambiguity in terms of what state legislatures could do. Now it's very clear that state legislatures do have to follow the will of their state's voters when it comes to appointing presidential electors.
Here's a wild idea. Since city people are more liberal, we should establish city-states instead of countries. Is that what that says? Maybe it's
instead
counties.
Of states, right? Probably you just make Manhattan a state.
Yeah.
But I mean, this idea has been out there. Like, you split California up into 4 states, and then you counteract the Wyoming problem. But I mean, it is a big problem because you look at population change, and more people are moving to more progressive, bluer areas and more urban areas in general. So by 2040, it's projected that 70% of the population is going to live in 30 states, meaning that there's going to be this huge imbalance in terms of the Senate. The Senate is basically already skewed towards wider, more conservative states, but it could be even more skewed based on demographic changes. So we either need to change the structure of the Senate, either change it altogether, or, as you said, admit new states, or some of those people that are moving to Brooklyn and San Francisco need to start thinking about moving to, Missoula or Casper instead. And we've seen a little bit of that during COVID, but not nearly enough to make up for these.
That's
huge
a wild
rural areas
statistic.
More conservative.
That 30% of the country is going to be whiter, more rural, more conservative, and it's going to elect 70% of the U.S. Senate.
Yeah.
So you say in your book, so the trend in the U.S. Senate is becoming more imbalanced, more undemocratic. So when conservatives, you say, want to go back and they want to quote the framers, they ignore that a lot of the framers, including James Madison, the architect of the Constitution, had grave concerns about some of the institutions they were creating, particularly the structure of the U.S. Senate.
Yeah, and that's a really interesting thing that I found during my research is Madison, for example, wanted the Senate to be an elite body, but he wanted that elite body to operate on the basis of majority rule. And he argued that the larger states should have more representation than the smaller states because that would be fairer in terms of representing the public at large. And he said that if you gave each state the same number of senators, it would allow what he called a more trifling minority than ever to control the balance of power in the body. Well, at the time, in 1790, the largest state, Virginia, had 13 times the population of the smallest state, Delaware. Today, California, the largest state, has 68 times the population of the smallest state, Wyoming. So in many ways, Madison might be rolling over in his grave seeing what happened then. And so it's always interesting to me when people invoke conservative originalism and they say that the Constitution has to be interpreted as it was intended at the time. And so my thinking is, what Constitution and which people? Because if you're gonna invoke James Madison to interpret the Constitution, don't you also then have to note that Madison and some of the other prominent founders were actually very unhappy with how some of the institutions they had envisioned ultimately turned out?
And that implies that they have allowed for a living, breathing document that can be revised, changed, and modified.
Yeah. And I think that's what they had intended. They intended that the Constitution would be modified. And again, it wasn't that hard to imagine amending the Constitution when there were only 13 states. And in fact, right after the Constitution was ratified, the Bill of Rights was added because the Constitution did not protect enough core rights. So people think freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, all of these things were in the original Constitution. They weren't. They were almost immediately added because people were like, wait, this doesn't protect our right to say what we want. This doesn't protect our right to hold these meetings and do these kind of things. So the Constitution has been changed over time to catch up with changes in the country. The problem is now, because of increased polarization and the barriers for changing these institutions, the Constitution is becoming increasingly antiquated and increasingly out of step with the diversity and the modernity of the country.
Well, you mentioned the diversity, and I'm just the last minute. I mean, the demographic changes in America are so substantial. I mean, you could even just say there was that once slavery was outlawed. You know, you had a whole demography that took a sea change, right, once that happened. But now you have it informed by many other things. I'm just wondering how that plays out. You write a lot about voting rights, and I think a lot about voter suppression and what's happening nationwide now to kind of prevent that demography from having the last word in any number of elections. You can do that through gerrymandering. You can do that through all the ways that you detail in your writings. Just give me a thought on that, on the changing demographics of the U.S. from a voting standpoint.
Well, the U.S. is moving towards a majority-minority future in which white people are no longer going to be the majority, and it's going to happen by 2045, the Census Bureau predicts. And I think that's what's behind a lot of the anti-democratic efforts we are seeing today. It's a rearguard attempt to try to protect conservative white power before it's too late and preserve a dominant white power structure from these new multiracial coalitions. So that's kind of, in my view, that's the universal organizing principle behind all of these undemocratic efforts, is to prevent this kind of majority-minority future from ultimately emerging.
And you discuss this in your book, and even there's some familiar figures in modern history, like Pat Buchanan, who was a part of this world and and even in this, I always hear people talk about the fact that they're Reagan Republicans. We've applied these kind of shellacked labels, where we kind of have changed in the branding what some of the realities of these political figures were and what their positions were. And I think the Constitution is one of those things. We've changed those things that you note in the forging of the document and the details of how it was put together. That's kind of gotten changed as we kind of idealize it. It's sort of what is done in political branding,
Yeah. That's absolutely right. And I think that was one of the reasons why I wrote this book, is because I feel like more than ever, we need an accurate rendition of history and an accurate accounting of history. And we have to connect the democratic crisis we're facing right now with the reason why it's happening in the first place. And I think a lot of people are asking me, how did someone like Trump emerge? And I'm hoping that by reading this book, I can give them some of the answers.
Oh, the book has so many great specifics. Albert, can you put a link to the book under this video, please? We'll drop this video separately from the main show. And can you do that, Albert? We'll have a link to your, I'll tell you what, I'll link to two things. I'll link to the book and I'll link to your website, okay? We have your website, which is, I think it's, what is it, Ari?
AriBermanAuthor.com.
AriBermanAuthor.com. I love it. We'll have that as well. My friend, it is great to have you in the mix. Maybe we'll get you one more time before the general.
Sounds great.
It really was exciting to finally get a chance to talk to you. I'm a fan, and I'm looking forward to more conversations. Thanks so much,
Mark.
Appreciate having Ari Berman, everybody. Hi, it's Mark, and I thought that was great. Hit the notification bell. You'll know whenever there's a new video being dropped, and please subscribe to our channel to help us save the universe.